So for my two different classes this time around, section 1, we did not start learning and memory at all. And section 2, we got in, I think, maybe 2 slides. And so I'm going to do a little bit of skipping and a little bit of condensing, and hopefully this will work out that you're both getting something new, but also there's a little bit of repeat, potentially, for section 3. Okay, so for my section 3 class, we actually did this slide. And if you want to, if there's a way for you to fast forward through this, you might want to, but obviously you don't have to. For the section 1 students, we did not do this slide. The beginning of learning and memory loss starts with an example of a patient with damage to his temporal cortex because of encephalitis. So he has pretty extreme damage and does not seem to have any awareness of any previous time in his life. And so I'm gonna read some of this actually. So he writes on a sheet of paper, "Just now, for the first time, I have suddenly become conscious." A little later, he forgets this experience, and so as far as he can tell, right, he's just now emerged into consciousness, because he obviously wasn't conscious when he wrote that, and maybe he feels like he was in this like sleep-like kind of period. And so he writes again. He crosses that out. He says, "Now I'm conscious for the first time." And a minute later, he looks at that, and it's in his handwriting, and yet it really just upsets him. In this fit of anger, he crosses that out again, and he says, "Now, the first time, I am fully conscious." Okay, so he's doing this, and they find this piece of paper that he's crossed out several times. I'm just now fully conscious, because there is no kind of awareness of what came before this. Life without memory really means no sense of existing across time. And if you're in section 3, we watched the Clive Waring, and I don't include that here because it's in the recording from Monday. If you're in section 1, you probably want to watch the recording, which will be underneath. And then come back to this question. And this is a good place to just pause if you can. So if you're watching this in the PowerPoint voiceovers, you can click off after reading the green question. And if you're in the YouTube, you can hit pause. But you might want to question or ask yourself, how does a person without memory maintain a sense of self if we have no sense of existing across time? And my section 3 class actually did an amazing job discussing, I thought, this question of just kind of this mesh of experience versus experiencer, and how much questions about how much do we retain personality and certain personality traits, as well as this realization that our relationships with other people are going to be really important in this kind of maintaining our sense of self, and just really had a much more sort of deep discussion in a lot of ways. And I'm sorry I missed the ones that I did, but those are the ones that I remembered than I've had in previous classes, because we're usually in person. People, I don't know, they don't get into some of those maybe metaphysical questions or really thoughts. And it's a very fascinating kind of thing to think about. So maybe pause and think about this, or if we've already done this, maybe just move on. And the thing about talking about learning and memory is that learning and memory itself is really quite complicated. And so we have to do some descriptions of what we mean by learning and what we mean by memory. So I'm going to start with this really classical way of talking about learning, in that it's called classical conditioning, as discovered by Ivan Pavlov in the early 1900s. And I'm sure a lot of you have been introduced to classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and I'm going to do what I feel is necessary for them. And if you are a bit confused, you might go look up a bit, but I'm hoping I get the differences across at least as much as we need to. Classical conditioning is really examining reflexes, automatic, unlearned responses. Ivan Pavlov was originally interested in digestive processes of dogs. He was a physiologist, not a psychologist. And so if we look at what he was examining, which was salivation, as part of the measure of digestive processes, this is a reflex. This is an automatic, unlearned response if we are salivating to food or whatever he was putting in the dog's mouths. Sometimes it was something sour, sometimes it was sand or something very not fun. But anyway, so what he originally was examining, what he was interested in was the unconditioned stimulus, and I'm going to use the stimulus of food because all of the sour waters and sands and things are immaterial. And I'm going to call that an unconditioned stimulus because it's unlearned. I don't have to learn to have some response to food as a dog, and the stimulus being the thing out in the environment, the food. That is going to cause an unconditioned response. Again, called unconditioned because I don't need to learn to have this response, and it's a response because it's me and my body and my behavior is responding. But again, this is an automatic reflex. When you put food in my mouth, I salivate. And that's what they found in the dogs, right? You put food in their mouths, you give them food, they salivate. What he discovered, though, was classical conditioning, where if he paired a tone with the food, so originally actually what he found, different stories, but I'm just going to use one, that the machine that released the food made a noise, click, click, and the dogs would start salivating to the noise of the machine. And so he started talking about this as an anticipatory reflex and started looking into basically what we now call classical conditioning. And he did use tones because you can manipulate the frequency of tone, how high or low in pitch a tone is, and you can look at different tones. So the conditioned stimulus is the tone, which we are pairing with the food. So we have a tone, boop, and then we get food. And originally the tone was a neutral stimulus, and that's an important piece of all of this classical conditioning, is we're starting out with something that's a neutral stimulus and we have no response to, and it becomes a conditioned stimulus as we're talking about conditioning or learning, as we learn to have some response. So we are pairing the food with the tone, where the tone is followed by the food. And we do that several times, and what happens is that the tone becomes a conditioned stimulus, and now when the dogs hear the boop, just the tone, they have a response of salivating to the tone. And because they're salivating to the tone, that's called a conditioned response, because it is a learned response. We learned the association between the tone and the food, and that now we have a learned response or conditioned response, which is salivation. This is my basic slide that shows the metronome instead of a tone followed by food. The dog is salivating. That again is automatic as we are getting the food. And then as we do this after a number of trials, a number of repetitions, now we can just give them the metronome and no food, and we're going to see salivation to the metronome. I will suggest that you go and watch the Pavlovian conditioning on The Office. It's rather funny, and it's very short as they keep trimming it and trying to make it so that it's not breaking copyright and that it can actually stay where it is. But it's a really great example of how really visceral and automatic and reflexive all of this is. So it's important to distinguish classical conditioning from instrumental conditioning, or what's sometimes called operant conditioning, that we are instrumental in the behaviors that we choose as we are operating on our environment. And this is different than that really visceral kind of response. It's a more volitional, so that we have a choice in what we're doing. We were volunteering and doing what we choose to do. This was really discussed by Edward Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. It comes from Edward Thorndike's 1913 Law of Effect, where he says responses followed by satisfaction will happen again. Those that are not followed by satisfaction will become less likely. And you can see in the example that if the cat in this example steps on that lever, it's going to open he or she's going to open the lever and get the food. And you can see on the right that in early trials, they are performing random errors, as he calls them, but really not performing the exact what they need to do to open the lever to get out of the box. And pretty soon they learn, right? So pretty soon they aren't making any of those random errors, and they're very quickly learning to step on the lever to get out of the box. The way B.F. Skinner talked about this was in operant conditioning, responses are followed by reinforcement or punishment that either strengthen or weaken behavior, respectively. So if we look at the rat, which he worked a lot with rats and pigeons, really, but if we look at the rat in this example, the rat goes at the top one goes off to the left and finds a Fruit Loop. The Fruit Loop is going to be reinforcement. So reinforcers are events that increase the probability that that response will occur again. So now it becomes more likely that the rat will go off to the left. We'll take that left turn. Punishment includes events that decrease the probability that a response will occur again. So if we take the bottom one, if we're looking at punishment, and the rat goes off to the left and gets shocked, that's punishment decreasing that response. And so now the rat is more likely to take a right turn and to not go left. B.F. Skinner, I'm just saying, really rarely worked with punishment and was much more interested in reinforcement as guiding behavior. I usually do show this really short clip of the Big Bang Theory and Sheldon training Penny, or operantly conditioning Penny. And again, I'm going to go suggest that you watch that. I am including, so now I'm going to end a little over 5 minutes, 30 seconds early to give you guys time to think about the first question and to go watch these two short videos. And just to be clear, clearly not all learning fits cleanly into classical or operant conditioning, regardless of what B.F. Skinner and John Watson would want you to believe. That's simply not true. One example in animals is the male songbird hears the song of his species over his first few months during this critical period, and then he just is able to imitate that the following year. And we see this a great deal in animal languages. We see this in human language, where we are learning the grammar of our language, and we can say things that we have never heard before, and certainly things that we've never been reinforced for before. So that's not how all learning works, and we're just going to leave that there for now. I'm going to come back to that much later in probably 2 or 3 sections maybe of learning and memory. Also, importantly, usually conditioning works best when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are close in time, and it takes several pairings. So usually we want this to be contiguous, and we're seeing this kind of acquisition curve where we are learning that association between the tone and the food or whatever. But some conditioning works differently than that, and one example is taste aversion. So my unconditioned stimulus being my illness, but then I'm going to start now having a response of feeling ill to just the taste of food, the smell of food, sometimes the looks of food, and that illness comes oftentimes hours and hours after actually eating the food. And we see this kind of taste aversion where we don't want to especially smell or taste that food again, but even sometimes look at that food again. That happens on one trial. So we see one trial learning, and we don't have to have this multiple pairings. Ivan Pavlov believed that conditioning strengthened those connections between what he called the conditioned stimulus center and an unconditioned stimulus center in the brain, so that we had these particular regions of the brain that were representing those stimuli. And we were making connections between them as we were learning that association, if that makes sense. So that we had an area where we represented the unconditioned stimulus, an area where we're representing the conditioned stimulus, and as we're learning that association, we're strengthening those connections. And so one of the people who believed this and went in to look for those specific connections, or what he ended up calling the engrams, so physical representations of what had been learned, so the specific connections of where we could see this learning occur with changes in brain activity, was Carl Lashley. And he set out to prove this by searching for these engrams in the cerebral cortex, and he made several cuts in the cerebral cortex looking for this engrams and these engrams. And I'm going to skip over some of the history here because it turns out this was not in the cerebral cortex at all. We're going to look for this in a different part of the brain. It was Richard F. Thompson and his colleagues who then realized and started to use a simpler task. So one specific example of classical conditioning, and they started to look in various subcortical structures. Specifically, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the cerebellum. The task that they used was an aversive conditioning of a tone with a puff of air to the cornea. So the unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air to the cornea. And we all know when we go to the eye doctor and they tell us to don't blink your eyes when I puff this into your cornea, that this is really difficult to inhibit. We have an automatic, unlearned response, so an unconditioned response of an eye blink when someone puffs air into our cornea. And so do rabbits. This research was done on rabbits. So what they do is they present a tone, boop, and then the puff of air to the cornea. And rabbits, as they have this, the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus presented several times, rabbits learn to give an eye blink response to the tone. Okay, they learn that the tone predicts the puff of air to the cornea. And what's interesting is we learn, and rabbits learn, other animals learn, that there's a specific timing to this. So as long as the tone, it has a specific timing with the puff of air, we not only learn to have an eye blink response, but we have an eye blink response such that we avoid the puff of air to the cornea. Okay, if this is making you think, oh, the cerebellum is really important for timing, bingo, right? Exactly. So your author has this really great picture that I don't have up here. I don't think they gave it to me, and I thought about creating it, but I thought it would take a while. So you just have to imagine in your mind boxes going an A box, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'll just go to G. And so what's going to happen there when I have some kind of sensory input is going to go to A is going to communicate with B to C to D to E to F to G, and G is going to communicate to my muscles. Okay, so some kind of motor neuron is going to go communicate to the muscles. And so somewhere in there, between the sensory input coming in and the muscle movement going out of blinking my eyes, learning is occurring. And for us to figure out where learning is occurring is pretty tricky, because if I stop the motor movement, so if anything's happening at, let's just say E, F, and G, and what those are really involved with is the motor response, then learning might still be occurring, but I can't see that learning that's occurring. So I have to start out as far as I can at E, F, and maybe F or E, and then move backwards and say, where is learning occurring? Is it occurring at D? Is it occurring at C? Okay, so this is what Richard F. Thompson and his colleagues did. And what's being shown in these figures at the bottom or the mid-bottom right is the very leftmost figure. So I can't see any A, B's, or C's. So the very leftmost figure, that is the basic acquisition curve. If you've taken learning and memory, hopefully, or introductory psychology,
I do this in several psychology classes, but that is the basic acquisition curve, where I have the number of trials along the x-axis. Along the y-axis, I'm showing basically the strength of the response, or I'm showing learning. I'm showing some measure of learning. And so in the first trial, I don't have any learning because I haven't learned the association yet. This is the first time I've gotten the association. By the second trial, I've done some learning. By the third, by the fourth, depends on really the study that we're doing and the specific association that we're learning. But so in this example, it looks like the fourth trial, I'm at my plateau. I am at my maximum learning. Okay, and what they're showing, so as we move off to the right in the next pair of figures, what we're showing is they have gone in and they have cooled the lateral interpositus nucleus, or else they've injected a chemical such that it's turned off or inhibited the lateral interpositus nucleus of the cerebellum, while the rabbit is getting the tone and the puff of air. And what we see in the top figure is what's happening while that LIP, while the lateral interpositus nucleus is cooled. And what's happening is it looks like there's no learning occurring, right? I'm never showing the acquisition curve. I'm never showing any learning. What's being shown in the figure underneath that is after, so now the lateral interpositus nucleus is back in play. The chemical's worn off, the cooling's worn off, and I can use my lateral interpositus nucleus, and they do the same thing of giving the tone, boop, and a puff of air. And what we see there is a regular acquisition curve. And so it looks like no learning had actually occurred. I'm now just seeing the same kind of acquisition curve that I saw at the start, without any brain regions being taken out. Okay, we're going to move one level out. So let's just say that was, if we look at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, let's just say the lateral interpositus nucleus was C. We're moving one level out to D. Okay, but it could be, right, that learning was occurring at D and I was not getting the sensory information. So we could move out to D. And so now we're going to look at which is the red nucleus, which is the midbrain structure that is communicating to motor neurons. If we move out to the red nucleus, and again, we're going to start with the top figure. We cool or inject a chemical so we're inhibiting the red nucleus. What's happening in that figure is no learning is occurring, right? Again, there's no response, no change in response, because we're getting the tone and the puff of air being presented together again and again. Now we bring back the red nucleus. We allow it to come back and the chemical to wear off or whatever. And we start presenting the tone and the puff of air again. Okay, and now we see that the animals are up at plateau, right? Even though the red nucleus was being cooled and we had no response, once we brought the red nucleus back, it looks like they learned this association because there is no learning curve. I'm already at my maximum learning. So we move backwards again. We go back again to the lateral interpositus nucleus and say, okay, that's where learning occurred. So they discovered the engram for this particular eye blink response, for this kind of classical conditioning, this aversive conditioning, in the lateral interpositus nucleus of the cerebellum. So I'm going to repeat some of what I just said in a lot of ways, but this is with words on the screen, and this is research that has been done on humans, so it is slightly different to discuss. But so PET imaging on people shows that if we pair a puff of air with another stimulus, so we have our conditioned stimulus and it predicts a puff of air, whatever that other stimulus is, tone, light, and so forth, it causes activity in the cerebellum, in the red nucleus, and in several other areas. We also see that people with damage to the cerebellum show weaker conditioned eye blinks and those eye blink responses are less accurately timed relative to the onset of the air puff. As I just said, what we learn to do is if we get the same timing between the tone and the puff of air, we learn to blink our eyes so that we avoid the puff of air. But people with damage to their cerebellum have weaker conditioned eye blinks, but also they're not hitting that at the right time to avoid the puff of air. And so if you remember us talking about damage to the cerebellum before, as people who have a harder time with keeping a rhythm or changing visual and auditory attention, this is another example of what happens when you have damage to the cerebellum. And all of this, as all learning in the cerebellum does, all of this depends on that short interval of the pairing between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, which, if you remember, if we go back to what do we need for classical conditioning, one is contiguity, a short pairing between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, at least for the most part, for things not like taste aversion.